Welcome to Curiosity Cake, the podcast about ideas for people with curious minds and big appetites. I'm Lee Delaney. I've made it my mission to bring you a feast of ideas across science, humanities, society and culture, and more. Each episode I'll be talking to an expert from academia or industry to find out about their work and what we can learn from it. If you like what you hear, please tip generously by rating the show and leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice. These are really important for getting the podcast noticed. I'd love to hear what you think of the episode so far, or if you have ideas for future topics. You can email info@curiositycake.co.uk or Twitter @curiosity_cake. There's also a Facebook page @CuriosityCakePod and website curiositycake.co.uk. On this episode, we're delving into sports psychology with Dr. Patricia Jackman. Trish has a particular interest in flow states and clutch performance. She's a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Lincoln. She's been researching the optimal performance state of flow in sport and exercise for almost a decade and has published several articles in leading peer-reviewed scientific journals. In addition, Trish also conducts research on topics such as goal setting, affect, and self-regulation in sport, as well as psychological well-being in PhD students, police, and exercisers. Now get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork, and dig into a slice of curiosity cake. Curiosity Cake. Patricia Jackman, welcome to Curiosity Cake.
Thank you, Lee. It's nice to be on. I'm looking forward to having a chat.
Yeah, thanks for giving us your time. I think you work in the area of sports psychology, but you have a very particular specialism in that. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so I'm a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at the University of Lincoln. You know, I teach on our undergraduate and our postgraduate programs and supervise students right from undergraduate level up to PhD level. But my particular area, I suppose, in the area of my PhD was around the concept of flow. And I suppose we'll get a chance to go into that in more depth over the course of the show. And the area, I suppose, is a real interest for me, and it was sparked by, I suppose, a lot of experiences in my teenage years when I was trying to work out what it was I wanted to do with my life. And I always knew the area of sports science was of interest to me, and I just became fascinated by the area of peak performance and the types of experiences we have when we feel and we perform at our best. So yeah, my primary research area, I would say, is in flow, but research in quite a lot of similar areas such as goal setting, affect, cognitive regulation, and so on. So there's a few kind of different areas that have some nice links with the concept of flow, probably being the primary one that kind of links to each of those.
And generally, do they all come under the idea of peak performance, optimal performance?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a number of ways that I look into this experience of flow and optimal experience. So I suppose first of all, when I started to get interested in this area, I was really interested in it from a performance perspective. And I suppose a lot of that would have come from my own experience as an athlete when I was growing up. And I was always really interested in learning how could I perform better? How could I find something that was going to give me an edge or maybe just let me tap into my potential? And I suppose over the years, I would have tried to learn as much as I can. I was, reading books or just listening out to interviews with athletes, trying to find, I suppose, the golden nuggets often that we're searching for. And it wasn't really until I went to university and started studying, I suppose, a raft of different sports science areas that I came on this concept of flow within my psychology module. I remember it in second year of university, and I thought that was it. That was the thing I was trying to learn more about. And from there, I suppose it's just really grown. But I suppose, as I said, initially it was really that interest in peak performance. But I suppose since then, I've started to look at something like flow, which is, a really intrinsically rewarding and positive experience that we have from the point of view of how could this actually be beneficial for people in a sport and exercise context? I suppose initially from a sporting perspective, ask the question, could it help people to stay involved in activity for longer? Might it improve their motivation? Could it have a positive impact on their well-being? And then I suppose starting to transition that into an exercise context, which is where so as my area of research has started to move in recent years, is understanding, well, if we could learn more about concepts like flow and positive effect and so on, and how those types of experiences can be created, could we provide people with more practical guidelines that could actually help them to have more pleasant experiences in exercise? And if that is the case, could we actually help people to become and stay more active, which ultimately can have huge benefits for people, not only for their physical health, but I suppose we're talking a lot more now about the mental health benefits of engaging in exercise. So going back to the question, I guess my initial interest was a performance perspective. Whereas now, I suppose that's transitioned and changed. And I'm still interested in that area, but also understanding how experiences like this, so optimal states and positive effect, could actually be cultivated and harnessed to increase uptake and adherence to physical activity as well.
You've gone from thinking about it in terms of your own sport and performance to a wider group in sport and exercise.
Yeah, and I think it's also thinking about, transitioning from being a student to now recognizing that as a researcher, I suppose what I'm interested and passionate about is helping people. And for me, I think, the more people we can help in society to become more active, to stay more active, the better off we will be. And for me, research is just one way that I try to do that. And I think in terms of impact that we can have at a societal level, exercise and physical activity is a context in which we arguably have a huge potential to impact. Sport as well, elite sport is, I suppose, exclusive to a very small percentage of people, but more generally, there's lots of people involved at more the recreational level, whether they're just training for runs or races. They're not necessarily, people who consider themselves athletes. They'll run in races and so on. And I suppose it's also that type of level as well. I suppose probably the level that I'm operating in myself in kind of recreational running, but thinking more broadly about societal impact of the work that we do and how that could actually have a positive impact on people.
Do you have any thoughts on, you're talking about there about the impact of elite level sport, and that's not something that too many people are involved in, but lots of people are actually interested in. And in terms of psychology and the COVID pandemic with the Premier League starting back up again, and part of the justification of that being that it's actually good for people's mental health to have some of these things that people enjoy starting back again.
Yeah, I think there's probably a number of ways that we can look at it, and I think as a society, people like to follow sport. We're, generally speaking, a high proportion of society are just fascinated sometimes by what athletes can do, and we're really interested in following that. And I think from that perspective, it can be really beneficial in terms of obviously people now have something to be focused on and be interested in as well. And I guess even thinking more broadly, I suppose it was probably a bit of a curiosity about elite athletes and their performance that really got me interested in the area of sports psychology, because I suppose for many years as a society, we've been fascinated, I would say a lot of the times, by, some of the real highlight standout performances on some of the biggest occasions in sport, be it from the Olympics to the World Cup. If you look at any scenarios, which are often, be it from a penalty kick in the dying moments, or a penalty shootout, right to, 100-meter finals, high pressure scenarios. And we often see, I suppose, people who will succeed and thrive in a pressure scenario, and then others who might struggle. And I think from that perspective, it's often something that fans, just as much as coaches and athletes, are interested in learning about the psychology. And I think even at present, we're watching football games and there's no crowd. And obviously they've made the sound is quite similar, but the experience must be quite different compared to the normal week for most of these athletes. They're used to going out and playing in front of, full houses every week, and now all of a sudden they're going out and it's an empty stadium. And I think from that perspective, the experience of those athletes is undoubtedly going to be different as well, and how they prepare psychologically, how they manage that will be a new scenario for all of them, or most of them, no doubt. They won't be as used to going out to play in an empty stadium. So yeah, I think there's a lot of dynamics and a lot of psychology at play at present, not just for the players, I suppose, but the fans as well.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. I like watching games without the crowd noise, so you can hear what's being said between players and coaches and things. I think that's one of the most interesting parts of it.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's get into flow then. It's something that sounds very esoteric to some extent. So can you tell us what flow actually is and when it occurs?
Yeah, so I suppose to give a bit of the background, some people may have heard of flow before and some may not. It goes back to the 1970s, and a Hungarian psychologist, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And in this time period, he was fascinated watching artists at work. So this concept doesn't initially come from sport. He did, in his initial study or work, look at some participants who were involved in sports, but initially his curiosity stemmed from watching artists. And as he watched the artists paint for hours and hours on end, he was fascinated by the fact that even though they were getting very little money for what they did, so that there wasn't a huge amount of extrinsic reward for them, they were totally immersed and could be totally immersed in the painting for hours and hours on end, to the point that they would become so immersed in it that they would almost forget, or it wouldn't come as a thought to them to stop and to eat or to drink or anything like that. They were just so focused and immersed. And for these people, it was an experience that brought them great pleasure. So his question was, why is it that something that gives so little in terms of fame and fortune, giving these people so much pleasure? Because I suppose as a society, people were traditionally focused on power and money and so on and so forth. So he became really interested in this. And he went on then to interview surgeons, basketball players, dancers. And what he started to find was people were reporting quite a similar experience. And what they were reporting was this sense of being totally absorbed in what they were doing, of feeling kind of a sense of control, even though you're in a challenging situation. And also that this experience was highly intrinsically rewarding. So that means it wasn't because of the external benefits that people were really interested and motivated. It was because of the internal benefits, the sense of satisfaction that they actually got from it. And one of the terms that some of the participants used to describe this state was this notion of flowing between the mind and the body, and almost the sense of being at one. So often we think about, activities in our normal daily lives where there's sometimes a sense of a disconnect, or our mind tells our body what to do or whatever it may be. Whereas in this state, the participants spoke about this notion of being in flow and being connected, and the mind and body being in harmony. So from there, that's really where the name came from. So flow is this intrinsically rewarding psychological state. And some of its key characteristics are that you get totally immersed in what you're doing. You feel as though your actions and your awareness merge to the point that you almost feel like you're on autopilot. You're totally focused on what you're doing, but it doesn't feel that hard to concentrate. And it's a really enjoyable state. And for some people, this state is also characterized by a sense of losing a concern for the opinion of others. So often those thoughts in our heads where we're worried about what people might think of how we're performing. And that seems to fade into the background when we're in this state. And then likewise, the time seems to either speed up or to slow down. Now, that's not always as prominent in athletic experiences. The fact that we monitor the time quite a lot, we're quite aware of the time, so that doesn't seem to come through quite as much, certainly in competitive contexts. But overall, that's what the experience of flow is like. And as I said, it didn't initially stem solely from sport, and we only began to research this in the early 90s, But over the years, I suppose the evidence base has started to develop, almost 3 decades worth of evidence at this point. But if we look beyond sport, flow is researched widely, from education to the workplace, to different types of leisure activities. So from that perspective, flow is considered to be an experience that can occur in any activity and has been widely researched in that respect.
So the language around it sounds very similar to maybe meditation or spiritual experiences, like losing sense of time, kind of merging, being at one, which I think is really, really interesting when you're applying it to like the area of sport.
Yeah, and I think one of the things which might make it a little different from meditation, for example, is the fact that these experiences occur when you're actually performing an activity. So be it, going out to perform in sport or, in the workplace, performing a task. And I think for me, that's why it's really interesting, because if we could help people to have better experiences when they're performing these activities, that could potentially have huge benefits, because we know, for example, that experiences like flow are linked to better performance in a sporting context. So people often perform at their best when they're in this state. So if we can learn more about how to cultivate and to facilitate experiences like this and help people to experience these states for longer, that could potentially have some really powerful impact in that respect. So yeah, I think has definitely got some parallels with other states. But I think that the aspect of performing a task, and a task often that's maybe just a little bit out of your comfort zone, a little bit of a challenge, kind of what we refer to as an above normal challenge, but also a place in which you feel quite confident that you could do this. So maybe it's a day when things are going well for you, your confidence is built up a bit. So you decide to stretch yourself a little bit further. Maybe push yourself a little bit outside of the norm. And often that can be when the magic happens, as it were, when we can reach new states and new experiences.
Are there other requirements then to be able to achieve a state of flow? Is it something that you can just switch on? Say, if you pick up a new sport, can you very quickly get to a point where you can access states of flow?
So I think that's a really good question, and one that certainly from our perspective and the researchers that I work closely with, we feel that there's still a lot more for us to learn about the occurrence of these states. So in our paper that we published in 2017, what we tried to do was to explore essentially the steps involved for people to enter a flow state. So to give a bit of background, I suppose, over the first 2 decades of research on flow, a lot of the work had established that challenging situations or feelings of confidence were associated with flow. But as of yet, we don't necessarily have a theory, so a set of steps or mechanisms that can actually explain how this experience occurs. So what we set out to do was we interviewed athletes soon after they performed towards the upper level of their ability or delivered an excellent performance, because that's what we thought would be the best way of getting an insight into experiences like flow, because it's one of those things that you can't necessarily predict that it's going to happen. And what we did, which was quite novel, was to interview people within days of the activity. So traditionally in the research area, a lot of interview studies had conducted interviews where people could reflect on experiences that occurred at any time in their career. But we felt that we needed to get a more detailed insight. We needed to learn more about the steps that were involved. And we felt that the best way to do this was to capture the data as soon as possible after these activities. So we interviewed athletes from recreational right through to world-class level and asked them about these experiences and what actually were the steps involved when you moved into this experience during the event. And I suppose there were a couple of things that were really key here. The first was the types of context, so the situations in which people got into flow. And what was an important finding, I suppose, was that flow tended to happen when people potentially could be doing something new. So often, let's say it was a runner who was getting out on a new route, or maybe they were going for a longer distance for the first time. It also occurred when people were experimenting or exploring, and did not tend to occur when people were under pressure. So it was a kind of an experience that occurred when we weren't in a pressurized scenario, when we had kind of a freedom to explore, to experiment, to try something new. And in those scenarios, flow tended to occur through a series of steps. And there were 5 of these. So when people were performing and they were in these types of contexts, often they occurred towards the start of events, so the start of a match or a race or whatever it may be. Typically, I suppose, when the outcome isn't on the line. So it was often in the early stages. And what started to essentially put the wheels in motion for this experience to occur was the first thing that occurred was a positive event. So that could be a runner starting a race and they get their first mile and it's really good. Their pace is really strong. Or maybe it's a football player and they just feel really good in the first few minutes. Maybe they go past a player or something like that. So that positive event was the first thing. And when that happened, that then led to the second point, which was positive feedback. So people recognized, okay, I'm going well here today. So they then start to, as we get positive feedback more generally, that helps to boost our confidence. So that was the third step. And as we boosted our confidence, people then started to say, I'm going to push myself a little bit more here. I'm going to challenge myself. So that was the fourth step. So as we build our confidence, we challenge ourselves. And then what was really interesting about this research was that the types of goals people set in flow didn't tend to be the normal SMART goals we often set. So during flow, people tend to report the pursuit of what we're calling open goals. So these goals are actually non-specific goals.
Whereas SMART goals would be, well, the S stands for specific.
Exactly, yeah. So these goals were non-specific, they were not outcome-based, and they weren't time-based. They were kind of along the lines of, I'll just see how well I can do here, or I might try some moves that I hadn't really pre-planned, or I'm just going to be quite spontaneous here and go with it and see what I can do. So that was then a key factor that underpins the ability to transition into an experience like flow. Now, what we did find is that athletes did report SMART goals or the specific goals at other points, but their experience wasn't characterized by flow at those times. So that kind of, I suppose, gives a different perspective on some of the early work in relation to flow, which suggests that we set clear goals. But what our work has started to establish is that it's not just about the clarity of your goal, but whether or not your goal is specific could actually be an important factor. So I suppose in terms of the steps and whether we can make it happen, I think flow, just going over the years through this work and research in this area, it's a little bit like the perfect storm. So I spoke there about that sense of the context, so the situation, your environment, and also good things happening, so the positive events. So there's a lot of things that need to come together sometimes for this experience to occur. And if we look at whether or not novices could experience it, I don't see any reason why they couldn't. Whether or not they're as likely to, I think that's something that would be really interesting to explore, because if you look at maybe confidence levels, they could differ a little bit, especially when you're starting out, or the likelihood of you experiencing a positive event. You might need to consider, well, what are your metrics for that? How are you going to measure and assess that? But I think, yeah, it's certainly not a state. And I think if we look back to some research in golf in 2016 by Christian Swan and his colleagues, and they spoke about this idea that flow is a little bit like letting it happen, and that you probably need a lot to come right for you, but these states can occur. Whereas other peak performance states are more along the lines where you make it happen, but these states are more intense, more effortful, probably experiences that are more difficult to prolong for long periods of time because they are so physically and mentally demanding. Whereas flow is kind of a state where people report that it's quite effortless, or their perceived effort is lower. both mentally and physically. So I think there's certainly scope for people who are new to an activity to experience states like this. And I think it'd be really interesting in future to look at differences between more novice performers and those who are more experienced.
There's a really interesting dichotomy there between, as you're saying, the kind of confidence to try things, but also I wonder if you're getting to a state where things feel easy, that maybe in whatever activity sport it is you're doing, maybe that only comes with a certain amount of practice.
Yeah, and I suppose it takes time. It takes time to get to a point where often we start in an activity and there's quite a lot of mental chatter, I would say. So we're using maybe quite a lot of instructional self talk. We're trying to tell ourselves what to do as we're performing the activity, as we're trying to learn it. We're maybe not necessarily always getting positive feedback because we're not necessarily performing well. And ultimately, over time, you think about it, when we started to tie our shoelace, that was something that we all struggled with. We had to try and think about doing it. Whereas over time, that's something that we just now do automatically. And if we were actually to think about tying our shoelace now, it would probably be more problematic to us than just trying to do it and letting it happen, as it were. So, yeah, I think certainly that sense of developing automaticity in your ability to perform skills is something that's likely to be beneficial as well.
And in terms of your research looking at recreational athletes and then world class athletes, are you finding any difference between those groups in access and flow?
I suppose in terms of, we didn't necessarily look at frequency, so it's quite difficult to comment on that. But what we did not find was that there was any difference in terms of what these people experienced. So the actual experience itself is that, we didn't find any differences. And likewise, the manner in which people moved into an experience like flow didn't differ. So I think from that perspective, at present, certainly from our work, we don't have evidence to suggest that there were differences. But that said, a lot of our work has been more qualitative in nature. And I think a lot more work will need to come with more quantitative measures to determine whether or not there are differences between those who are the more elite versus the more recreational level. But as of yet, we've certainly in our work, we haven't found a huge amount of evidence to suggest that there are differences in how it's experienced or how it occurs.
Is it a difficult area to research? I imagine if you're trying to look at world class athletes and you're trying to talk to them about this state as soon as you can after it's happened, that can maybe be something that's difficult to do.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I don't think we had too many athletes at that level. And sometimes it can be just pure good fortune. But for us, I suppose the key thing is that, whether it's a top level athlete or someone who's more sub elite, if they have delivered an excellent performance or they have had a positive, rewarding experience, our work suggests that there aren't huge differences. I suppose in general, it's a really hard area to research because the very nature of trying to research in this area is that you can't really preempt when experiences like this are going to occur. So even at the minute now, one of the studies that I'm doing, it's very much a case of looking to see if experiences like this may have occurred. So you're kind of almost at the mercy of hoping sometimes, especially if you're conducting research that's kind of more interview based and quite opportunistic. And then likewise, if you're in a lab-based setting, I suppose the challenge always is how likely are you to be able to create and induce a flow state in a clinical lab-based setting, for example. And so I think from that perspective, it always poses challenges. Even looking at the methods that we use, it's very difficult to capture data live on an experience like this because of the fact that if you stop somebody or disrupt them whilst they're in an experience like this, potentially you're going to inadvertently disrupt the very experience that you're interested in. So I think one of the things over the years, it's been a great learning point for me are some of the challenges, even just within this very niche research area, and just trying to overcome them. It's a challenge, but I think it's a good challenge to have as well.
And are there people who are actually working on those lab-based experiments?
So I suppose over the last couple of years, we haven't necessarily been targeting flow because we're trying to develop some measures at present. But we have looked at the area of different goals. So, just for an example, my colleague Rebecca Hawkins recently published a study. She was looking at the idea of open goals and how open goals, which are obviously conducive to flow, could have an impact on other psychological variables. Particularly, she looked at performance and she was looking at affect, which is how pleasant or unpleasant an experience is. So I suppose Rebecca's work has been really interesting in that area, and likewise another kind of collaborator, Christian Swan, out in Australia, he's published a number of studies in the area of open goals of late as well. So that's a key area of our work at present that we're undertaking, and Rebecca had some really interesting findings in her work. What she wanted to do was to look at how SMART goals, so specific measurable goals, compare to open goals in a walking task, but specifically wants to know about how that might differ between people who are what we call insufficiently active, so they're not a very active population, and those who are very active. And she found some really interesting findings. And I suppose one of the key findings was that in the SMART goal condition, the people who were really active responded really well to that, both in terms of their performance and their experience. So they really enjoyed that, and they found that experience really pleasant. And it was significantly more pleasurable for them to go follow a SMART goal than it was to follow an open goal. So the see how well you can do. Whereas the opposite was the case for the insufficiently active group. So what we found was that the insufficiently active group, they reported that pursuing an open goal was more pleasant and more enjoyable than a SMART goal. Now, if we think about physical activity promotion, traditionally, what a lot of us, what we're advised to do is to pursue specific targets. So we, exercise for 30 minutes a day, whatever it may be. But if it is the case that pursuing specific goals might make people's experiences less pleasant, that is a bit of a problem from an exercise psychology perspective, because we know that how people feel during an activity is a strong predictor of whether or not they're likely to continue to engage in that for the long term. So that research is actually really interesting and important, and I suppose we're trying to build on that work through Rebecca's work in the next couple of years as well, is to look at, well, how and why do people who aren't as active respond better to these more open-ended goals? And if it is the case that these goals are quite useful, how might we actually go about implementing them? So I think in terms of looking at lab-based studies for flow, there are some examples out there, I suppose more so in other areas. So typically cognitive tasks or computer-based tasks, those sorts of things. But it's a bit more challenging to do that in a sport and exercise context at present, but certainly something that we'd like to move towards going forward.
And is this related to, I see quite a few people who are maybe personal trainers or whatever, where they now encourage people to, like you're saying, instead of saying, you've got to exercise 30 minutes a day, they might say, do something for 5 minutes, as long as you just do something. If you do longer than that, great. But if you just do that minimum amount, that's better than nothing. So you're slowly building up your habits.
I think, there are certainly some parallels. I think if you just look at a goal like 30 minutes of activity, which is what we're advised to do, if someone doesn't do the 30 minutes of activity, doesn't get the whole way to 30, for a lot of people, that can create a sense of, I failed or I haven't achieved a goal. And because of that, people might lose confidence. They mightn't feel as good about themselves. Whereas if we actually flip it and say, doing something is better than nothing. And it's a case of, starting with something small, doing what you can at a different point in time. Because for a lot of people, starting to exercise is actually a very complex task. And that's one of the issues with, if we add in a SMART goal to do that. If we look at goal setting theory, for example, the original theory actually stated that when people are in the early stages of learning a new task, if it's a complex task, that setting a SMART goal might actually be harmful for their performance. So if we translate that into an exercise and physical activity context, it could be the case that if we set people SMART goals when they're new to taking up physical activity, that could potentially present a challenge for them. So I think that's something that we're really keen to continue to explore moving forward. But like you said, I think sometimes having these kind of specific goals, 10,000 steps a day or whatever it may be, it immediately creates a barometer by which we're judging ourselves. And I guess the thing with an open goal is, to some extent, it removes the opportunity to put in place a barometer. So to some extent, you can't necessarily fail. You're always going to succeed because you're going to do that little bit more. So yeah, I think that there are certainly merits in actually considering more broadly how we apply goals and how we actually utilize them to increase physical activity.
So you've mentioned something there about enjoyment, and you were also talking about in the flow state, you're not trying to force or make something happen. And that contrasts to another area that you research, which is clutch performance, which is related to flow and has some common characteristics, but has some differences as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an area of research that has started to emerge more prominently, I suppose, in our work over the last couple of years. And a colleague of mine, Matt Schweikel at the University of Wollongong in Australia, has just published a really great systematic review in this area where he's essentially brought together all the studies that have looked into this notion of clutch performance and reviewed them and kind of give it a bit of a summary of that literature. And I think so there's a lot of people at present have possibly watched Michael Jordan's The Last Dance, and the notion of him being kind of a clutch performer would have been spoken about quite a lot. And I suppose the idea of clutch performance is, it's generally a term that people might be familiar with in a lot of the American sports, so baseball and basketball in particular. So it's quite an Americanized term where it originated. The idea of clutch performance is that it occurs when athletes essentially step up their performance in a pressure situation. So over the years, there was generally this assumption that when athletes are at their best, the state of optimal functioning, so just one, was flow. Whereas our work in recent years, as we've started to interview people soon after performances, is that we found they're not only reporting flow when they're at their best, but there's also this second experience, which is referred to as what we call a clutch state. And clutch states are the experiences that are often underlie a clutch performance. So when you perform at your best in a pressure scenario, this is what the experience is like. And as you said, it shares some characteristics with flow. People are absorbed in what they're doing. They feel very confident. They feel in control. But there are some quite distinct characteristics. So the first of those is kind of around this idea of concentration is much more effortful, much more intense, and a lot more focused on a specific target. Whereas in flow, it's a bit more effortless. We're focusing on what we're doing, but it doesn't seem that hard. Whereas when we're in clutch, these states often occurred towards the end of a performance when a game was on the line, or when you were trying to push out towards the end of a race to hit a PB. So people were really focusing intensely. They had a real clear focus on the end goal, what they wanted to achieve. So it was more effortful mentally in that regard. A second characteristic was that people tended to be a little bit more aroused. So it was a more intense state. People were often a bit more pumped up when they were in this experience compared to this more relaxed, somewhat blissful flow state. In addition, another factor that differentiated a clutch state was that sense of you're performing automatically. So you're still executing the skills automatically, but you are much more aware of the situation. So you're aware that the time is ticking down. You're aware of the scoreboard. You're aware of the time that you need to run to hit a PB or whatever it may be. So there's a lot more what we call critical thought. So a lot more analytical thought that is taking place during a clutch state. Whereas during flow, even participants I'm interviewing at the minute, one of the common things they refer to almost the sense of switching off. you just switch off from the situation. Your awareness of what's going on around you isn't that high. Whereas in clutch, it's quite intense. You're very, very focused on what it is you're doing, what you want to achieve. And it's very much focused and geared around achieving specific goals when you're in this state. So yeah, over the last few years, that's kind of another kind of parallel area that started to emerge more in our work, and something that certainly we'd hope to continue into the future as well.
And it's another area where you've been looking at it in terms of exercise, where similar to flow, there are ways you can look at developing your research that can help people maintain kind of exercise over a period of time, but in a different way to how that works with flow.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things with clutch is that whilst really good from a performance perspective, if we look at exercise and sport, it is actually a state that leaves people feeling quite exhausted. So you can imagine if you're coming towards the end of an event and you put in a finishing spurt, you feel quite tired. Nonetheless, people do feel very proud, a sense of achievement after it. It's not necessarily, certainly in an exercise context, what we found is people don't report that it's an enjoyable experience when they are in it, but their enjoyment comes after it. So the positive feelings that actually come from being successful, from achieving a personal best, or from pushing out another couple of repetitions on a bench press that you haven't been able to do before. The actual activity or the act of performing the task is not necessarily enjoyable, but it's the enjoyment appears to come after. So a little bit different from flow in that respect, because that's considered to be a lot more enjoyable, a lot more blissful. And the thing about clutch as well is that because it is so intense, so effortful, what I'm was trying to look at the minute is the types of strategies that people are using to prolong this state, and also to prolong flow, and what could we actually do or advise people to do when they get into these states in order to prolong them? Because obviously that can have applied benefits for people too. So yeah, I think the key thing is that there are these different states, and it's recognizing, I suppose, how to manage them most effectively could be really useful for us moving forward.
So what can we as ordinary people take from flow and clutch then?
Yeah, one of the things I guess for me when it comes to flow is, a really important thing, even speaking to a lot of people, interviewing participants at present, is this just importance of actually focusing on the enjoyment. So going out to enjoy an activity, and that's often not necessarily something we always try intentionally to do. We go out and we do perform the activity and we get it done, but how can we actually enjoy it? And if you can find ways to do that, for some people it's, they get on a certain playlist and they really enjoy listening to a certain type of music, and that gets them into it. For other people, it can often be getting out into a new location, getting out and finding some green spaces, whatever it may be from an exercise perspective. But also thinking more generally about your life and maybe any hobbies or interests that you have. And it's finding things that give you the pleasure, give you that sense of pleasure, and that you enjoy doing and that you enjoy getting absorbed into, that can really help to promote experiences like this. If we're looking from I suppose, a clutch perspective, that, as I said, tends to happen in these kind of pressured situations. So to date, we're not really aware of any studies that have looked into this beyond the sport and exercise context. So I think that would be a really interesting area, and one that I'd be certainly keen to look at. How could something like clutch apply to a workplace, for example, where often we're in pressured scenarios? Is it the case that people experience flow? Or is it the case that there could be a different experience that we enter when we're, trying to get a piece of work completed on a deadline, or we're trying to reach a new level of performance? So I think it'd be really interesting to actually shift this work a little bit into the performance context that aren't sport or exercise, but actually move it into other often highly pressurized environments to see, can we learn more about people's experiences when they perform at their best? And if so, could we actually start to provide some guidelines to help them in those scenarios? And I think from that perspective, that's where there's huge potential for this area moving forward, not just from a sport and exercise perspective, but from areas like the corporate sector as well.
And I think you hinted a bit at this at the start, but have you had your own experience of flow states and clutch performance?
Yeah. And I suppose that's one of the things over the years of it doesn't always happen. Just I think I often use the example just because a biomechanist knows a lot about how the body moves doesn't mean they can move their own body well. So I think it's often the same with psychology. Just because I might have some knowledge about flow and clutch doesn't mean I can just do it. So my interest definitely sparked from my own sport. This was growing up in Ireland. I played camogie and basketball through my teenage years. Played
I
camogie.
think you're going to have to explain camogie then.
Yeah. So camogie is the women's equivalent of the Irish sport of hurling. It's probably a challenging sport to explain verbally, and it's probably best to go and take a look on YouTube or somewhere like that, because I mightn't give the best explanation, but to give a sense of it, it's a game that's played 140 meters by 80-meter width pitch. Goalposts are like rugby goalposts. You get a point if the ball goes over the bar, and you get 3 points if it goes into the goals. There's a net on the underneath the crossbar. And fastest game on earth, I think potentially that or lacrosse, similar. So the ball is a small leather ball, not too dissimilar in size to a cricket ball, nowhere near as hard. You play with a wooden stick called a hurley, and I suppose it's not too dissimilar in terms of a hockey stick, in terms of the general shape, but it's a flat stick. So unlike the curve on the hockey stick and the depth in it, it's a flat stick, and you play with two hands. Unlike hockey, you play left and right. You play two hands on your top of your stick, and
you would play more with the ball in the air rather than on the ground.
Exactly, yeah. So you can pick the ball into your hand. So you have to scoop it up into your hand. You can take 4 steps if you wish, run with the ball, and then you strike it in the air. And, the ball typically could travel, 80, 90 meters in one strike. So it's a really fast game. It can move from one end of the pitch to the other. And in hurling, in camogie, 2 goals can be 6 points within 60 seconds. So games can literally turn so quickly. And, just more generally, Gaelic games would be the biggest participation sports in Ireland. And they'd be the sports, I suppose, most generally, even though they're not played internationally in terms of countries, even though, there are clubs all over the world now. There's British championships as well. There's the World Games that happens for clubs outside of Ireland once a year as well. And I suppose, that's been my sport. Played since I was 7. And a big thing about playing in the sport of Gaelic games and playing camogie is that loyalty to your local club. So even that, despite the fact that I've been living in the UK now for almost 6 years, I would always have considered, my club Galtier to be my team, and I would sort of continue to travel over and back to play with them. And I suppose it was kind of in those early years I started to have experiences in my teenage years where I would come off a pitch or come off a basketball court and just kind of think that was a little bit different today. And I just couldn't really put my finger on it. I didn't know what it was. And it wasn't until, as I said earlier, going into my university class in the second year and coming across this concept of flow, and that was when it kind of clicked, and that's when it made sense to me as to what I'd been experiencing. So yeah, it was definitely my early experiences. And I was very fortunate. I had a really good coach at my club who taught me a lot of the skills of the game. And it's a game that you constantly practice your skills at home, and I really loved it and really interested in. And I suppose that interest continued right up to COVID. We were involved right up to March of this year. So yeah, it's a fantastic sport.
You were saying you've been playing at Croke Park?
Yeah. So we played the All-Ireland Club final in Croke Park, and it was one of those ones where we were a point down with a couple of minutes of injury time played. And yeah, we managed to get a goal. My sister Una popped up in the forwards and managed to stick the ball into the back of the net. And this was my sister Kira behind me as well. So that was really special to play in Croke Park with your three sisters. And the last free that would have hit in. So I was striking the free. I hit it as cleanly. I couldn't have hit it any better. And Una just managed to be on the end of it. But Kira was our goalkeeper, and apparently she was out in the middle of the field calling for a short pass. So I didn't see her, thankfully. But yeah, very, very, very special. Very special. I suppose, look, with the current scenario, it's the last time I've seen family, and who knows how long it'll be since we get to do that. But to win an All-Ireland club title, to do it in Croke Park, and to do it with your family is very, very special. And, you know, there are players there I've played with since I first started 20 years ago, and we're still soldiering on together. So yeah, really special, really special. And I suppose anyone who's been part of the GAA, they would just get it in terms of what it means. And I suppose it's a really great sport. If you're ever looking for a sport to go and watch somewhere in the world, going to Thurles for a Munster Hurling Championship game or getting up to Croke Park is definitely one I think everyone should do, because the atmosphere you get around the place it's very, very different. You know, all sports have their own atmosphere and I suppose culture and so on and so forth. But Gaelic Games it's an amateur sport. I don't get paid, even though train equally as much, I suppose, as a lot of professional athletes. And at the same time, we get up and everyone works their day job on a Monday. So yeah, it's a very niche sport.
And very related to the politics of Ireland and Northern Ireland and the history of the Civil War and naming de Valera, which could be a whole other episode in itself.
Yeah. And I suppose if we look at Irish history and how it's evolved over the last kind of century and a bit, even going back to the early days of Gaelic Games, you know, it was a lot of key milestones in the association of Gaelic Games would have often were tied to quite historical periods. And I think one of the great things about it is that it is now becoming such an open sport, and getting lots of people from different backgrounds who are getting involved in it. And it's definitely one thing, I suppose, about the Irish culture that people are generally very proud of, and it's something that gives a lot of people, especially those who are abroad, who are Irish abroad, gives them a sense of identity. Wherever they go in the world, they know that there's probably a club where they're going, and they might join it, and they can make a new set of friends. So despite the fact that it's considered to be an Irish sport, you know, we've seen over the last few years how it's really exploded, I would say, all over the world. You know, there's thriving Asian championships, Australian championships. Last year, the World Games were on in Waterford in Ireland, and that essentially brought together teams from all over the world. And it was just amazing to be there and to see it, because there were two competitions. There were the native competitions and the non-native competitions. The non-natives were for those who had an Irish background, so they were Irish players. But then there was the native competition, and that was something very, very special to watch. You know, to see a team of Galician Spanish players playing hurling, talking in Spanish, and none of them with Irish roots. Or, you know, there were teams there from South Africa, Argentina, Russia. You know, places that you just could not imagine hurling or camogie being played, and they were there and they were performing really well. So that was really special to actually see how a game that is stemmed from a country can actually just be applied and to transcend borders and to bring people together in a way. It was really, really, really powerful to see.
And it's reminding me of my last question around the flow state in particular. Are there differences between individual and team sports when it comes to flow?
I think it's an interesting one, and something that, you know, we haven't necessarily explored.
Could you get into flow as a team?
Yeah, so I think that's something we're hoping to look at it going forward, because I think even in larger sports teams, so, you know, the sport I come from is 15, the likelihood of you getting all 15 to click on a given day, I think it's often challenging. And I'd say a lot of coaches and managers scratch their heads wondering how can we get them to do it, or even in a football game, you know. But what we often kind of, just from experiences and people say, is that you kind of maybe you get a sense of being very attuned with two or three players around you, and it kind of clicks. So I suppose over the years, if we think about, I suppose, football partnerships, you might have your two up front. And I think, because they were given the example in a podcast I was listening to lately, it was kind of Dwight York and Andy Cole.
Andy
And
Cole.
they kind of had that relationship that they knew where they were. They didn't necessarily have to think, they just knew. And I think things like that would be really interesting to explore in terms of the interaction elements, but also the environment. Some of the work can certainly move forward if we look at, what, from a coaching perspective, what should I do? What should I actually do? Or maybe not do can often be the case, because sometimes if, typically a couple of athletes have reported to me previously that going in at half time in a game can actually be very disruptive to a flow state, because suddenly they'll have information being fired at them about these are all the stats, and suddenly they start to think critically, which essentially takes them out of being in that state. So it's kind of thinking about how could we manage those scenarios better. And I suppose moving forward, that'd be really interesting to look at. If we look at some research in golf, just to kind of take it a little bit a different angle, what's really interesting about that is that elite golfers have said that what actually keeps them in flow is not thinking about golf. So rather counterintuitive in that respect. And even some of the runners and the research I'm doing, a lot of them speak about this sense of looking at the scenery, being almost distracted, but positive distractions, not kind of worrying about what they're going to do in work or how they're going to get home in time, whatever it may be. Just having some positive distraction would be helpful to take your mind away from thinking analytically. So from that perspective, I think areas like that are really important moving forward.
But maybe brings it back around to start of the conversation when I think of how it links to, or sounds a bit like meditation again. There's something there that's about not thinking, which is very similar to meditation, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's more so about the level of effort we're exerting. I think that's a really big thing, and the types of thoughts we're having. So in like just some people speak about the idea that they don't look at their watch when they're out for a run. That's actually really helpful, because that's taking away a cue that would make them think quite analytically. So even avoiding looking at their watch is something that they've said is quite helpful. Likewise, I suppose that sense of listening to music or looking at the scenery can actually be quite pleasant. And as you said, it can take our mind away from maybe the burning in our legs or the fatigue or things like that, which do eventually override, I suppose, our distractive efforts. But nonetheless, they can certainly for help for a period of time.
So my last question then, I think, is around, as I was reading some of your papers, there's some very interesting quotes from different sports people that were involved in your interviews. And one was a rugby player, New Zealand rugby player who was playing in the Rugby World Cup, talking about he wasn't even thinking about the fact that he was playing in a Rugby World Cup. That kind of wasn't registering to him in the moment at the time. So it just makes me think, for you yourself as the researcher working on those bits of work, what's maybe the most exciting snippet that you've taken from an athlete?
So hard, because I've had so many really great ones over the years. Yeah, I think at the minute I don't know if I can necessarily pick out one, because there's just so many really good ones there. But I think for me, it's what I found really interesting is how people talk about kind of flow. It's a real blissful type of experience, and one that could last for long periods of time. Whereas clutch is a more effortful state, and while it's good for performance, it's quite mentally draining. So I think that's something I'd really be interested in looking more into, from certainly even taking some kind of more objective physiological measures to see, are there actually differences here between these states? And if so, can we start to extrapolate more about that type of information? So they would be some examples. And I think even going back to some of my work in particular with jockeys, which I really enjoyed doing, was that sense of the horse and the jockey almost feeling as though they were at one, which is quite different, obviously, to any other activity. And the sense that the horse and the jockey, they were just they were in tune with one another. You know, the sense that the jockeys felt that when they were in a state like this, they didn't need to do much. They were just going along. They were totally in rhythm, and you can imagine, you know, when you even the sound, you can imagine the sound and that rhythmic sound.
Rhythm seemed to be a big part of that. I think the jockeys were talking about
Yeah,
being in rhythm with the horse.
yeah, definitely, and it was that sense of. I think it's a very hard thing to describe for a jockey because it is such a, a sensory experience, what they actually experience. It's all about how they feel, the pressure they might be exerting or not exerting, or what they feel through their hands. And sometimes those things are actually quite hard to articulate, especially when they're so experienced and it's probably been something they've been doing for so many years and almost taken for granted in the sense of those senses. But yeah, the sense of rhythm was a really key thing, and they always spoke about that sense of feel and that sense of you just got a good feel from sitting on the horse. You knew that they were in good form. You knew they were calm, relaxed, and also that sense of when you get up and you're riding a good horse is that sense that they can pick a jump. They know where the stride is. You don't actually have to force them to do it. So for me, as someone who was very new to that kind of world, that was really fascinating for me to actually learn about something totally different and something that, you know, for a lot of people it's hard to empathize with, but in terms of actually learning about it, you can kind of make sense of it as well.
Yeah, it just takes me back to being a kid and trying horse riding lessons and having the instructor telling me your horse is doing this, your horse is doing that, it's not meant to be doing that, and I'm just keep thinking, well, it's not my fault, it's the horse.
Yeah.
So yeah, the whole jockey thing's completely beyond me. I think I'm glad you got that in at the end because that's another interesting area of your research as well. That was a really interesting conversation, Trish. Thanks very much for that. And I think there's probably some really good things that people can take to try to apply to their own kind of sport and life or exercise.
No, thank you. It's been great, and I've really enjoyed talking about this area. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, you know, if you want to, feel free to link in my email. So it's pjackman@lincoln.ac.uk. Again, if you just search Trish Jackman Lincoln, you'll be able to see kind of contact details for my staff profile. And on Twitter, I'm at Trish_Jackman. And again, if anyone wants to get in touch about the research, be it as a participant or maybe you want to read more, just feel free to get in touch, and I'm happy to share any papers that I've published to date.
Yeah, and I can link to your bio and to papers that are online in the show notes on the website as well.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode as much as I've enjoyed making it. Remember to rate and review the show on the podcast app to help us get noticed up against the big media company shows. And I'd love to hear what you think of the episodes and if you've any ideas for future topics. So get in touch via email info@curiositycake.co.uk or on Twitter @curiosity_cake. Don't forget the Facebook page @CuriosityCakePod and website curiositycake.co.uk. On the next episode, we'll be talking to someone who studies ants, so feel free to send in any questions you might have. Bye for now.